Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Tim Keller, the Auditor for the State of New Mexico. Thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here today.
Now, I used to follow you when you were in the Senate, because you were a senator for a while. You would bring these bills forth that I thought were so wonderful, the tax expenditure, bulky name though it is, and the incentive, the effectiveness of the incentives. And I watched these bills pass the House and the Senate and then get vetoed, and it just made such sense. So you have a finance degree from Notre Dame, an MBA from Harvard. You are gifted mathematically, and I love your perspective on these issues. Talk to me about what the auditor does and what you are doing to make it a more proactive office.
Sure. The auditor is a very unique position in our state in two reasons. One is, around the country, we actually only are one of 16 states that have an elected auditor. And it's really done that way for independence purposes, so that the auditor's office isn't beholden to a legislature or a governor or anything like that. And so you truly get, the voters really are the ones who hold the auditor's office accountable. And I think that's a good thing for New Mexico. And what the office does, we're charged, it's pretty basic, oversight of all public entities financially in New Mexico. So we're very unique in that we deal with each state agency because they're individually audited. So they're treated like kind of its own piece of government. And then we also audit all the cities and all the counties and the acequia associations and the land grants and the housing associations. So there's 900 plus entities that actually we oversee. Yeah. And, we do it in the annual audit process, which is required by law. And we also do special investigations when issues of fraud, waste, and abuse come up. And so those are kind of the two things that our office does. And we can go deep into a small community on issues or statewide for different issues in state government.
And we'll come back to some of those smaller local issues because it's really interesting what you're finding. But you when you chose to make this a more active, proactive office, you set up the GAO. Tell me about that.
Sure. The GAO is the Government Accountability Office, and it's the first one in New Mexico. Of course, our federal government, it's one of the things I think most people agree is a great thing. And so it's modeled after the federal system, and some other states have one too. But basically, the GAO is looking at statewide finance issues. So statewide spending on contractors, statewide procurement issues, statewide fund balance issues, a lot of things we'll talk about. They're looking at those systematic structural issues that we see at cities, counties, school districts, and at state government and that kind of thing. And I think it's really going to help address some of those underlying structural issues that I tried to work on in the legislature. But one of the great things about the auditor's office is I don't need any other legislators to give me 50 votes to pass a bill or a governor to sign it. I can actually just work on some of these issues.
And you were voted because a lot of you were voted in because so many people agreed that what you were doing was so important and was so long overdue. Well, you've been discovering some piles of money, and so you've been most famous for this $4.5 billion that you found in money that was. Tell us about the treasure trove that you found, and can we use it?
Sure. Well, our first GAO report was the Money on the Sidelines report, and it's on our website if listeners want to go through it. And, let me just say what we did, because it's very basic. We just took the audited financials from every state agency, and they list in their audit the unspent fund balances. And these are for one-time capital expenditures. So it's not operating budget. This isn't salaries or anything like that. It's for one-time purchases. And all we did was basically add them up and say, hey, let's shine a light on where these dollars are. And it turns out, we all know, I think intuitively, you need some money on the sidelines. You're waiting for projects to be completed, or you're waiting for matching funds and so forth. But when you add it up to get to $4.5 billion, the number was just far larger, I think, than anyone thought.
And isn't that 70%? That represents 70% of our current budget, more or less.
More or less, yeah. Now, these are different pots of money. These are
yes.
one-time monies.
But just in terms of the amount.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a very good way to look at it. And the other perspective, I mean, it's $5,000 per voter. You can kind of parse it in different ways. It's prepaid. So these are dollars. The legislature's done their job. They already allocated the money. And it's, sort of waiting to get out the door. And so there's kind of two questions. One is, why isn't it being spent? Can it be spent? Is this a prepaid stimulus that we should just get out into our economy? And the other question, of course, which a lot of folks really want to know is, can it be moved? Can I move it to my project? Or can we use it for this particular thing?
How long has some of this money been sitting around, already allocated, ready to be spent? There's some that go back many years?
Yeah, and there's a varying degree. So there's 700 different accounts. And that's why the question on how old the money is or how it can be used, there's really 700 different answers. Mm-hmm. So it's not easy to go into it. But in general, lots of the money dates back 2, 3 years, 4 years. Some money we know goes all the way back to 2008. And so it's a broad range, and some money is kind of, last year's capital outlay was about $400 million, and I think the report from LFC says that about half of that has been spent. So it adds up. It piles up over time, and unless you're paying attention to it, it's just going to keep piling up.
Well, thank you. I love that you call it money on the sidelines. And so there has been talk in the press and various politicians about taking some of that money for the capital outlay bill that died this session. And the capital outlay is so important because it gives small amounts of money all over the state, and it would be a tremendous economic boost. So can the capital outlay, how can people get their hands on this money?
Well, the interesting thing is about $1 billion of this is capital outlay from the legislature that already been allocated. Another $1 billion is still for infrastructure projects, but they're like executive priorities. So they're the Environment Department with water restoration. There's $700 million for water projects. DFA, that's where the capital outlay,
$1.2 billion.
And that's the capital outlay chunk. It just lives at DFA. But NMFA is sitting on hundreds of millions. So these agencies, I think there's really two answers to your question. Is one is can some be moved and not? The report lists all the levels of restrictions. So you can kind of go through all 700 and figure out what can be moved and what can't be. And that's, I think, what a lot of staff is doing right now. But the other question is, let's say you wanted to put capital outlay in Santa Fe for new parks. Well, chances are somewhere in that $4.5 billion, there's already money for parks. So it's much more faster and efficient just to spend the money that's already there.
Now, Senator John Arthur Smith, famous Dr. No of the Senate Finance Committee, he talked about how they could claw back some of that money and pointed out that really, clearly, it shows us how much reform is needed. Mm-hmm. And he did call for the governor to step up. Who can fix this?
Well, there's a couple of things to do, and Senator Smith is a sage on this, and he understands how it works, and he actually taught me about these funds. I learned this from him when we had the solvency crisis a couple of years ago. So there's a couple of things we can do. One is the money that's there now, just by definition, they're all in the executive branch. So that's why, by default, the governor has to step up to get the money spent, because literally the money is physically all in her agencies. So that's just a fact. And so he's right that the governor really should take the lead on this. Now, the legislature can go through and identify funds that are not encumbered and so forth and literally sweep them, and that's what we've done in the past. And we can also make that automatic. So I think there's going to be some legislation looked at in future years that says, if you don't spend the money in 3 or 4 years, it goes back to the legislature to reallocate. And that's just a smart way to do things. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. So we have so much to talk about. We're going to leave the money on the sidelines and the $4.5 billion, because over here there's a whole question, and this is how you first came to my attention as a senator, of testing the effectiveness of incentives and all of the loopholes and the tax breaks in the Swiss cheese of our tax structure. tell me about what's happening there and how we can close those loopholes.
Sure. Well, and you mentioned, I think, the best metaphor for this. And over time, our tax policy was once upon a time built on, 3 primary types of taxes and so forth. Over time, we've drilled holes in that. So our tax policy looks like Swiss cheese. The last study we had showed that the holes in the cheese were about 20% of the piece of cheese. And when you do the math, basically that means there's about $1 billion that we don't collect. So we choose to not collect through loopholes and carve-outs and different programs. We choose not to collect those dollars. Now, theoretically, that means, though, that taxes for everyone else is 20% higher. And so this is where, for a long time, senators and folks have said, hey, why don't we try and move that the other way? Maybe decrease taxes for everyone, but pay for that by closing some of these loopholes. So we've never been able to get a handle on this. And in fact, every year we keep adding. I know the tax package this year was another $10 million of Swiss cheese. So we need to understand the return on investment. And some might be redundant. Some might be really amazing. But we don't know, other than the film industry. So the one victory I had was
the
that
Breaking
study.
Bad bill.
Yeah.
Well, so some of them must be antique and outdated and archaic. This whole thing came up when there were existing film credits to encourage the wonderful amount of film work that's been done here. And at that point, when Governor Martinez came in, she said, no, we can't give them any more incentives. But then someone said, well, look at the number of incentives that the oil and gas industry gets.
That's true.
And then there are things, I bet there's probably buggy whip manufacturer tax exemptions. There's some that go so far back. Didn't they do one for airplane mechanics? I mean, they're just someone. Can you actually convene a blue ribbon task force and just look at all these exemptions? Is there any way to go start at zero base and add on the ones that are relevant to us now?
Well, we're going to try, and this is really a 4-year project. So thank you, New Mexicans, for giving me 4 years.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll see what happens. Maybe it'll be 8. But this one's going to take a while, but we're certainly going to look at it. And what we're going to try and do is work on what you mentioned. We know there are 300 plus of these, and we know a lot of them go to the early 80s. Basically, especially in extractive industries, but also in any new industry, we've kind of always put in these carve-outs, and over time they've just added up. And so we're going to look at a slice to understand kind of how big the problem is first. So we're going to kind of test, all right, what is the real return on investment for a few different types. And then from there, I think we're going to be able to say, okay, let's do the whole thing. It's going to take 3 years, but let's do a blue ribbon task force. Or, you know what, these are all for a good reason, and, maybe they're whatever. So the first thing we're going to do is try and do a test, a pilot, to really understand it. And the film incentive has been a good one. That one we do measure appropriately. And the verdict basically is that the film program is really good for New Mexico. And so we want to get to that kind of understanding for all the other big ones.
We're speaking today with our state auditor, Tim Keller. Thank you for taking the time and helping us understand these things. Another big surprise that you found was that within the state's own books, there was $100 million in discrepancies. Honestly, this is, another horrifying development. Will you tell us about that?
Well, this one is, it's all, it's embarrassing for New Mexico, and it is a problem that is complicated in its roots, but simple in what the real issue is. So 8 years ago, we changed accounting software systems, and this happens in life and in companies. But when we did that, we literally lost millions of entries. And so when we turned the new one on, the numbers didn't match what was in the bank. So now today, we have a checkbook analogy where basically our checkbook, which is our accounting system, says one thing, but then our bank account at the state treasurer's office says something else. And we know the range now is between about 47 million and 475 million.
Ouch.
And so people are estimating that it's about 100 million. But we need the accounting answer, just like you would normally, is you write it off, right? At some point, you just have to take the hit and move on clean going forward. And we're not able to do that right now. So one of the things my office has been working on is, luckily in recent years, I want to give the administration and the legislature credit for owning up to this. And even when I was in the Senate, everyone agrees this is a problem, agrees we got to do it, we got to figure out what to do. We just want to make sure that we have a clean audit going forward. And right now we don't. Our state audit is late by a year and it's disclaimed, which means it's so bad, no one will even give an opinion on it.
So, and this is the audit that we give then to the feds, right?
Correct. Yeah, it's called a CAFR, a Combined Annual Financial Report.
And we're a year late and out of whack.
That's right.
Unbalanced.
Yeah.
So bad, you said?
So and it's because of this issue. And so we're trying to make sure, number one, shine a light, ask for accountability, that this is a priority. You can't sweep this under the rug for another 8 years. And bonding agencies are starting to take notice. And I think New Mexicans are saying, hey, get your act together. And so we're changing some of the financial rules, and we're at least going to make sure that every year we're going to know exactly where we're at on this. And I think hopefully in a couple of years we can fix the problem, but it's going to take vigilance.
Well, that's our state finances on the large scale, but you also have many specific local issues. Santa Fe has just been in the news lately because of a discrepancy with a $30 million bond that was supposed to go to parks. And they found out that there's a mess there. Can you tell us about what's happening with that? Because it's your job as state auditor to be sure that that has integrity, and it doesn't seem to.
Yeah, and that's why we are, number one is we're stepping in, and we were not a part of the process previously, which is a little rare. Usually people call us kind of early on, and for some reason this actually all happened outside our office. So I think that's created some problems in a sense of fixing the issue going forward. But we're now communicating with City Council and with the mayor, and we're developing a corrective action plan going forward. And we're also considering looking and making sure that there wasn't any fraud looking backwards. We've recently had some hotline calls. We have a very effective hotline, and it's pointing to some possible issues with respect to where those dollars went. And so right now, as this is taped, we're considering and evaluating perhaps a special investigation. And so we're going to do at least those two things and look at all the options and make sure we do what's right for Santa Feans. But I think the challenge with this issue is that the findings came out, the administration's changed, a lot of the people have changed, and there's a question of how much paperwork there is. And that makes even my job as auditor, if there's nothing to audit, it's very difficult for anyone to do their job. And we're also running up against that issue right now with the city's paperwork.
And also one of the things that they said in the paper was, well, we were afraid people were going to lose their jobs, so we took people from the steno pool and had them building the parks without the proper training or skill. And, well, I'm glad you're on it, because if you do find criminal activity, then you pass it on to the Attorney General, right?
Right. Yeah, and what we can do is, I think the best news is going forward, now that we know about this, we can test for it every year, so we can make sure that it doesn't continue. But we got to put the past to rest, too. And if we find criminal activity, we also have been in discussion with Attorney General Balderas, and we will notify him right away. And he said he'll pursue whatever leads are forwarded his way. So I think the good news is we're positioned well, but now we got to churn through that whole past issue, and hopefully the documents surface. And actually, if anyone's listening and wants to call into our office,
what is your hotline number?
1-800-OSA, that's Office of the State Auditor, fraud. So 1-800-FRAUD. Call in and let us know, because we're formulating the best path forward right now, and we could use your input.
Great. Now, they just mentioned a couple of the other local things. Hatch had a problem. What happened with Hatch? Hatch,
of course, famous for green chili,
yes,
the chili capital of the world, and New Mexico, so it's dear to everyone's heart. But like a lot of places, they got into some trouble with their spending. And what our office found, and this was in collaboration with the previous administration, really two issues. The city was taking fees they were receiving and moving it into a sort of Christmas party fund.
Oh.
And you just can't do that. And that's not a huge issue, but it's wrong. And so we caught them doing that. But the biggest issue here is they were using some funding that they had gotten through different ways, and they needed to invest the fund somewhere. And the city actually, they bought land. They were speculating on land development in Las Cruces, and that's illegal. And terrible for the folks in Hatch, right? Because their financial tax dollars are now in the hands of a developer in Las Cruces. So we put a stop to that, and I think the good news there is that there's a new administration in Hatch, and they've put to rest these issues as well. So I think it's a good example of how this works. You know, we shined a light on it, we held the folks accountable, and now things have changed.
There was the McKinley County Sheriff's Office, too.
And that one is ongoing. This is an issue all around New Mexico. We have DWI funding that comes from the federal government. And it's very tempting for police departments to use that funding for overtime pay and, you know, to sort of pad other areas in their budget. We've had some leaks and whistleblowers that this may be happening in McKinley. That is ongoing, and so we are sharing the allegations. It's the public's right to know what we're looking at. But the verdict is still out, so we'll see how that turns out. And I think what we want to do is make sure that at least everything is clear so that that funding can keep flowing. Because we want to make sure that we can do that. And right now, that's sort of in question. And so that's what we'll try and resolve.
Well, you know, when I hear all these major financial things that you are dealing with, I'm so happy that you're there, that we're you know, riding the ship of state is going to be on an even keel now. You do something else. You are doing workshops. You're going out and you're teaching government entities about the rules of the game to protect against fraud, waste, and abuse. And that's so wonderful. Yes, you discover it. Yes, you correct it. But you're also educating people, because some people, you know, I mean, we do have a conscience in the sense of right and wrong.
Sure.
But some, you know, people need to be reminded of what the law is.
Yeah, and there's studies on this, but as much as 3/4 of all fraud, waste, and abuse is just people not knowing exactly how things are supposed to happen. There's another fourth that can be sort of intentional, but in general, education is a big issue. So our offices, we're trying to be proactive to not just go after fraud, waste, and abuse, but to also try and prevent it from happening. And that's what this is designed to do. So if folks are out, you know, all around the state, whether it's Portales or Clovis or Roswell or Gallup, you can check on our website or with our office kind of where we've been and where we're going. But even rural areas, we've been this week up in Taos and all around teaching a lot of land grant and acequia folks how to sort of conduct audits and deal with the state. So we get our staff out there, and it's very practical. It says, you know, here's the 6 things to do to get a good audit. And, you know, that kind of sort of FAQ, that's what it's all about. It's not about rules. It's not about academia. It's just tactical tips on how to make sure your books are current and correct.
You know, we've had some problem with state treasurers in the past, and I remember when Michael Montoya, former state treasurer, was sent to jail for, $600 million. He actually said, but kickbacks is how we always do business in New Mexico. Yeah. So is there a cultural thing, the old way of doing business, and the legal right, and I guess it's a new way. It should have been the old way all along. But is there a little bit of a culture clash here in New Mexico?
Well, I think one thing is it's changing. Whatever it is certainly evolving. And I think each time, whether it was that issue or even the Manny Aragon issues, I do think New Mexico gets a little bit better each round. And our problems now are not nearly as egregious, I don't think, as they have been in the past. And that's a good thing. But I think the root cause is really around rural living in general, and it just has to do with conflicts of interest. So you get in any state with a rural population where, you know, everyone's related, everyone knows everyone, and, you know, it's impossible to hire anyone when they're not related to someone else. And if I want my road built and, you know, my cousin's the only one who actually does road building, you know, so I think those issues are really endemic of rural America. And they're hard to deal with. And so I think that's more of a root cause than anything else.
Well, what lights you up? What do you love pursuing? I mean, you've got all these incredible projects, all of which are very necessary. What thrills you when you finally get something straightened out? What is it, the area that you like the most?
Well, I think I love to see the connection between kind of transparency and accountability, because in our office we're the auditor, so we're usually looking back and shining a light on something. But you do that for a reason. You do it to try and correct a problem. And so I really view to me, the best thing is when we come in, and whether it's a state agency or an entity, folks say, yeah, tell us what's going on, and then we'll fix it going forward. And we've been fortunate. Hatch is a good example of that, and some issues in the state government. That's how it should work, and that's why we have a state auditor's office. And so I really enjoy it when we can connect that transparency with then some accountability that actually makes New Mexico a little bit better. That's what I'm in it for.
Ah, well, you're doing a wonderful job. I wanted to tell you, I went back to your, when you ran for this office, your ad was voted by all these national blogs as the best political ad of the year, and it was a Breaking Bad ad. Can you tell our audience, since we can't show it, a little bit about it? You filmed it where?
Sure. It was filmed at the Octopus Car Wash, which of course was famous in that TV show Breaking Bad, and also right around where I grew up. So for me, I'd still actually this weekend I'm going to that car wash. Actually, I noticed my car needs a wash. So that's where it was filmed. And, for us, as a state auditor's campaign, no one really notices what you're campaigning on. I mean, this is just life in America. And so, if you can, we wanted to be a little bit creative and maybe bring a smile to people's face too, in terms of, that's kind of a good frame way to look at things. And so for us, especially in Albuquerque, this was a great way to connect, going after fraud, waste, and abuse, and some visuals that people recognized and so forth.
And the music.
Yeah, and the music too. And so I think it was very well done, and it's something that it was a game changer in our campaign. I think without that ad, given how things went kind of just demographically and voter turnout wise and so forth, I might have lost. So I think at least we had a good time doing it, and it also, I think, was a game changer in the campaign.
And your metaphor for cleaning up some of the soiled areas.
Of course, is the car wash. And so that's the point of the story, is
and that's,
the cars going through and getting washed and the grimes coming off as I'm talking about cleaning up state government.
Yeah, and you are doing that. So I'm really grateful that you came here to tell us about it.
Well, thank you. I'm going to think of that now when I'm going through that car wash. So it is. It's a good analogy. We had to think of something about, there's a famous comedy, of course, where they use sweeping up government, and so the guy was going around with a broom all the time. And so ours was a car wash.
Well, that's because we're Albuquerque, and we love Breaking Bad. Anyway, I thank you for what you're doing. I hope you come back soon and give us an update on all this, especially that $4.5 billion that everybody would like their hands on. Our guest today is the State Auditor for the state of New Mexico, Tim Keller. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Great to be here. Thank you.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.